Hello and welcome to another episode of the Little Knowledge Podcast with me, Paul Busby, and as ever with Goff Morgan. Hello, Goff.
Hello. Greetings, Joe. How are you doing?
Now, I can confirm that this man exists because I actually saw him in the flesh yesterday.
Indeed, I poked you with a stick just
He
to be on the safe side.
He literally poked me with a walking stick.
Well, it is bizarre. I think maybe a lot of people are finding this during the current predicament. Is you see people once a week or twice a week online and over Zooms and all this sort of business, and you think you see them, and you suddenly realise it's over 6 months since we were actually physically in the same building. It's bizarre, isn't it?
Absolutely is. We've got some heritage news, Goff.
Dum.
Heritage news. Yes, we have a possible sale, Pencoid Castle, which was an old Morgan property, among other people.
I'm not sure I know Pencoid Castle.
Well, it's near Llanmartin and end of the wood, or top of the wood, as Pencoid means. I got a little picture of it, if I can nip that up. Right, there we go. Pencoid Castle.
Nope, can't say I know of Pencoid Castle very much.
No, it was an old...
Is it a 19th century sort of faux castle, or on the site of an older one?
No. Well, it's mostly an awful lot of Tudor involved here, although there were Lord Rhondda tried to restore it in the late 19th, early 20th century, which was a bit tricky.
Those crenellations look a bit Victorian, don't they?
Well, there's
but
certainly
the windows, those great tall windows there do look very Tudor.
Yeah.
Those particularly sort of,
There's certainly been alterations. It's up for sale in an auction. The guide price is 950,000 in just over a week or so. So we'll see what happens.
Is there any internal structure?
It's got a roof. It's got a roof.
Gosh. That's always the start of a property if it's roofed, isn't it?
It is. There you go.
Oh gosh, I can't original fireplace.
There was a time when, at 2000, I think, when they wanted to build, this was going to be the centre of Legend Court, which was going to be a big theme park, possibly based on a film studio.
Yeah.
It didn't happen in the end, but you can see it certainly has promise, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating structure, isn't it?
Now, the newspapers have run with this, of course, castle up for sale, and most of the stories are the ones you'd expect. The Morgan who was knighted by Henry VIII, and the Morgans of Pencoid and all of this. But I actually like the 18th century, because a completely grumpy individual moved in to get away from everybody. He said he didn't want neighbours. Now, I know when I show you his picture that you will not believe that he was grumpy, but this man moved in the middle of the 18th century.
Yes, he's not a cheerful soul, is he?
Well, as a general rule, Admiral Thomas Matthews of the Matthews of Llandaff family. The Navy, I think, are always far more strict and severe with failure than other parts of the forces. Maybe it's because the Royal Navy was so powerful that failure seemed not an option. But when he failed, his career was ruined.
Oh, gosh.
He's essentially cashiered, and he retired as a bit of a grump. But and you don't really blame him. So he bought Pencoid Castle. Another person who owned Pencoid Castle, believe it or not, was Sir Thomas Wood. Now, the last time Sir Thomas Wood appeared on here was when he built the pavilions of Piercefield House, you might remember.
Oh, gosh. Oh, well.
There must have been a time where Sir Thomas Wood was just buying historic properties in South Wales, right, left and centre. But it's this chap's son I want to have a quick look at. There he is. It's another Thomas Matthews, but this one is an army captain, later major. And this is by Gainsborough.
Yeah.
And Gainsborough didn't finish this.
I was going to say, it's just the underpainting. The coat's not been done red, is it?
No, and there could be a reason that Gainsborough did not approve of this gentleman, who behaved absolutely appallingly when it came to this lady. It's a beautiful soprano, Elizabeth Linley. Now, Captain Matthews was married, and he became obsessed with Elizabeth Linley and harassed her. Just harassed her continuously. It was really bad. She had a champion, though, in none other than Richard Brinsley Sheridan,
good
famous
Lord.
playwright.
I shall be referring in passing to Brinsley Sheridan later on.
Well, excellent. Well, it got so bad that there was a duel between Sheridan and Matthews.
You're not going to believe this. That's what I was going to tell you.
And you've got all the... I tell you what, then.
I never realised it was this guy. I knew it was about a lady. Oh, blimey.
Well, what we'll do then, we'll move on, because you remember that, and you can see how beautiful she was. You would fight at least 3 dragons for Elizabeth Linley, never mind having a duel.
I didn't know the full detail of the duel, other than that it happened, so... I didn't realise the extent of it.
Well, there were several. There were a couple of duels. First one was won by Sheridan, in a way. The slightly cowardly Matthews was saved. At least he seemed cowardly, but he can't have been that cowardly because he demanded a second duel. And this time it was so rough that when Matthews' sword broke, he kept stabbing at Sheridan with the jagged end. And he battered Sheridan to such an extent he thought he'd killed him. So Matthews fled to the continent. So it's all very bloodthirsty, as I'm sure you'll mention when we get onto duels later on. But yeah, so Pencoid Castle up for sale, everybody. It's there, 950 grand. You're onto a winner there. But tonight we are not talking about that. If I stop this share, we're not talking about that. We are talking about a place called Cliver. And by the way,
also referred to in Newport, people call it Clytha.
Yeah,
incorrectly. Clytha Park in Newport and Clytha Square and things like this.
And that's because
Cliver, isn't it?
That's because the Clitha family owned a lot of Newport, so it is the same place. It's just
I never knew that.
It's just as I did, being from Newport, I presumed it was Clytha.
Yeah,
no, it's definitely Clitha. And Jones of Clitha actually wrote a lot of poetry. He loved his wife so much. Very romantic episode so far, Goff. He loved his wife so much. There's a lot of poetry. And he does tend to rhyme Clither with hither and thither.
Yes.
So it's not hard to work out how he pronounced it at the time. Although someone told me once, a school teacher friend of mine said, whenever one of his pupils pronounces a word incorrectly, a mispronunciation, he knows that that's probably because the child has read the word rather than overheard it. So in his mind, then that's a far better way. Clither is it's just east of Abergavenny.
Yes.
It's on the...
You can drive down through Cliver. That's a way of getting back down if you're going along the main road area.
Yeah.
You're going to pass a wonderful pub called the Cliver Arms.
Oh, yes, which will feature in one of our stories later on. It's on the old Abergavenny to Raglan road. Now, originally, the Clither itself, the house was there owned by the Berkeley family, who are a Worcestershire sort of borders family that had land on both sides of the border. But then, after it passed around a bit, it finally settled on an owner, William Jones. And the house he actually bought looks a bit different to the one there is today. So if we... Goodbye, Elizabeth. There we are. That is the house. That is the previous Clither House, as it was called, in the 1790s. And that was the property that Jones bought.
Oh, right.
Now, Jones was
substantial, isn't it? It's got the wings on either end. And yes, it's very, very...
Yeah, it was a large...
That little building down on the left, I wouldn't be surprised. I think it's either a dovecot or it might actually be a dairy building or something, a dairy building.
You're thinking of how the Friars in Newport has a very similar dairy building there. Yeah, it's entirely possible. William Jones was a Roman Catholic, and so it was quite tricky buying property and amassing a great estate. Now, he thought he'd almost won the lottery when he married a very wealthy heiress, Elizabeth Jones. She became Elizabeth Morgan, as was. There she is. Now, she was the only...
He said it's impossible to avoid the Morgans, isn't it? They are everywhere.
No matter how hard you try.
They've cropped up at some point collaterally in practically everything we've done so far.
Well, it is
Every
South East
podcast,
Wales.
It is fascinating as you go through this, the way, all these ruling families interlinked and intermarried, and it's a real little oligarchy for the area, isn't it?
Well, Elizabeth was a catch because she was the only surviving child of a Knight of the Bath called Sir William Morgan of Tredegar. And it got to the point where it was a big legal battle. And by the way, her story we will touch on in far greater detail in a future video. So we'll pass over it now. Suffice to say, William Jones thought that if he had inherited the Tredegar estate, won it in this legal battle in his wife's name, it got him to the top table of landowners in Monmouthshire, which was quite hard for a Roman Catholic to do in the late 18th century. It didn't happen, but if it had started as a dynastic marriage, it definitely ended up in an enormous love match. Because when Elizabeth here died in 1787, William Jones was completely broken. And so what he did, with the help of an architect called John Davenport, he started to build a memorial, almost like a mini Taj Mahal, a memorial of his grief as a folly on a hill near Cliver House. And the books still survive. He says, £1,000 to this company for some Gothic furniture. That would be quite nice. And it's quite clear that William Jones is a real part of the design process for this folly that became known as Clytha Castle. Now, we've got to have an Alamy stock photo. We're almost sponsored by this.
I think we need to approach them. That's astonishing, isn't it?
Yes. So there it is.
What a very complex referencing going on within architecturally there, isn't it? Because it's not quite your classical Gothic. There are Gothic elements, but that centerpiece is very peculiar.
It's a remarkable building.
In the middle of it, you have that is a sort of Templar cross there.
Right. Well, he had a few issues. There's a great story that one of his ancestors, Reggie Herbert, says. He says that when William Jones built this, there were all kinds of wild rumours around in Monmouthshire. As being a Roman Catholic, he was probably building a massive fortified castle just in case the French land, so he could support them.
So, what a giveaway! I'll just quietly build an enormous castle. No one will notice.
Well, really, it was a relatively small castle with lodgings as a testament to his grief, and you can see it as it looks today. There it is.
Wow, fantastic building.
And at the end, we'll have a little nose around. I like to end these videos with the nose around a property. So at the end, we will have a little look in here. But to make sure nobody forgets the reason that Clytha Castle is built, there's a plaque, which is a bit battered, but there it is. And it reads, "This building was erected in the year 1790 by William Jones of Cliver House, Esquire, fourth son of John Jones of Llanarth Court, Monmouthshire, Esquire, and husband to Elizabeth, the last surviving child of Sir William Morgan of Tredegar, Knight of the Bath, and granddaughter, never forget it, of the most noble William II, Duke of Devonshire. It was undertaken for the purpose of relieving a mind sincerely afflicted by the loss of an excellent wife, whose remains were deposited in Llanarth Churchyard, AD 1787, and to the memory of whose virtues this tablet is dedicated."
That's sweet.
But it goes on, in Llanarth Church itself, which is having a real battle at the moment. It closed in 2013 and having a real battle to decide what they're going to do with that church. There's a huge poem, even more that William Jones has put to his wife, including the words, "To enumerate her virtues was impossible. She was, in short, purity and innocence itself. For if ever these virtues were personified, they were in her." He got it bad, didn't he, poor chap?
Yeah. She was a canny customer, wasn't she?
She was.
That presentation of her having all the feminine virtues actually, shall we say, slightly eclipses the tenacity and general cleverness of the woman as well.
And believe me, we won't let Elizabeth Jones go.
No, I think we're looking forward to coming back to her. She's a splendid character.
He also built around about the same time with the Gothic style, these wonderful gates. And they were created by John Nash. John Nash of Buckingham Palace, of the Royal Pavilion, Brighton.
It's not an attributed to, it's a definite.
No, we know he paid money to John Nash, and for years it was thought that John Nash had built the Clytha Castle folly itself. But it turns out that was done by John Davenport, which people really believe. Nash got money for something. It was probably these gates, you see.
Yeah.
So that was the idea. But the present Clytha Park, as it became known, the new mansion, is not on the same site as the old.
Oh.
It's a little bit to the southwest, and there was a lake, and when they were digging the lake, they used some of the soil to make a mound on which to build the new mansion. William Jones didn't build it. He died childless, and his great-nephew, William Jones the Younger, took over, and a completely different style and far more to my liking. There we are. This is Neoclassical, a Greek revival building.
Yeah.
With those wonderful ionic
isn't it? Yeah.
columns. It's a beautiful building, isn't it? So have a little closer look.
Oh, gosh. That's a front entrance, isn't it? Look at that.
And when you walk into it, the entrance hall is extremely airy. It's lit by a lantern from above, and it has this sort of classical feel. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Good Lord.
But such a different style.
Oh, yeah, completely different.
Yeah. Anyway, this was built in about 1821 to 1828. So it's that sort of Regency and onwards period. By a chap called Edward Haycock. He was the architect for this. Now, the Jones family, Jones, and all of a sudden they're called Herberts. The reason for that is this William Jones the Younger, who created this magnificent Clytha Park, he wanted to change his name. What's in a name, Gough, I say? Is a surname so vitally important? But it clearly was.
If you're trying to, but if you're branding yourself with Herbert, that's got connections with the the Beauforts and things like that, isn't it? Family and
it's an ancient.
It's an ancient name. I say, it's an ancient name in this area. Because they were, the Herbert family were phenomenally influential in politics and society within Great Newport area.
This is where problems came, actually, because they changed their name. The one of the Joneses of Llanarth had married Lord Llanover's daughter, and he wanted to change his name to Herbert, and he got permission to do so. So the Llanarth cousins became Herberts, while the Clytha Joneses continued for a while until 1862, when the chap who built this building decided he wanted to take the grand name of Herbert as well. But at this point, Lord Llanover, who was Lord Lieutenant, didn't like this idea at all and tried to block him from doing it. It got to an extraordinary, it got embarrassing. There were letters in newspapers firing back and forth. Everybody thought it was a great joke, but there must have been personal animus, I think, between Lord Llanover and the Jones family of Cliver, because it got ridiculous. Nobody gave an inch. It really was foolish. It got to the extent where when Reginald, the son of the builder of this, wanted to join the Usk Fishing Association, its chairman, Lord Llanover, threatened to resign, saying, I cannot. He comes in as a Mr. Reginald Herbert. I am sorry, I cannot recognize Mr. Reginald Jones under that name, and I shall resign on the principle.
Lord.
So there's something we don't know there, isn't it? There's something bubbling below the surface that history has not recorded. But in the end, the Joneses did become the Herberts. And when William Herbert, who was obsessed with paintings of religious paintings that were in Clytha Park, when he died in 1885, his magnificent son took over, Reginald Herbert, or Reggie Herbert, as he was known throughout Monmouthshire. There he is in his racing colours of rose and diamonds, you can see there.
Yeah, famous for riding very long, thin horses.
Very long, thin horses. Hang on. There you go, if that makes you feel
better. That's a bit more glam, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a better one. But he was great. Now, you can imagine the man if I describe him, right? I've got a little description of Reggie Herbert. With an old-fashioned silk topper cocked jauntily on one side of his head and in a loose-fitting dark blue Melton drive-in overcoat, a high collar, and bluebird's eye neckcloth, and his trousers turned up au naturel, not ironed down, over an immaculately polished pair of button patent boots, and a bunch of violets in his buttonhole. Reggie Herbert was known as one of the finest dressed men in the kingdom. Something of a dandy, but he was a magnificent horseman. He won many races. Him and Colonel Frederick Morgan of Rupera were genuinely assumed of that generation to be the best horse riders in the area. He helped introduce polo into this country. He was the master of the Monmouthshire Foxhounds for 17 years. He won Emperor Napoleon III's shoot-in prize in Paris in 1869. He was involved in coach driving. So one of the best shots, one of the best riders. He was described with some justification as one of the greatest sportsmen in the country. But I like him because he's one of these characters that is just essentially up for anything and never gets down for very often. But he was always having all kinds of catastrophes.
Oh, gosh.
One of my particular favourites was when he was accidentally involved in a riot. He went along to see what was going on, and they pushed him towards right at the front. And unfortunately, as he got to the front of the riot, 50 policemen turned up and arrested him as the leader of the riot. Threw him in jail. Reggie Herbert said, quite frankly, I felt like Mr. John Frost, the Chartist. They threw him in jail for this. And when he was in jail, he had to think of someone to pay bail, and he realized that his tailor was just down the road. So he got someone to get his tailor up at 2:00 in the morning to bail him out. And he basically said, if you do tell him, if the old boy doesn't bail me out, the only clothing I'll be able to wear are those provided by Her Majesty's government if I go to prison. At one time, he was at a race in Windsor, and he was doing very well, as Reggie Herbert always did, riding very well. And the horse threw him, and he went into the spectators' enclosure, and he landed on where the refreshments were, on a big trestle table. So he got covered in punch and sandwiches and jam and everything like this. And as he got up and walked back to the changing enclosure, everybody was laughing at him. And he thought, oh, they're just laughing at me. It was only when he sat down and things felt a bit cold that he realized during the fall he'd lost his riding breeches. Extraordinary character in many, many ways. But I do like him. He spent far too much money. He was done for doing illegal gambling houses he was running. He once rode 45 miles in 12 hours for a £1,000 bet, which he won.
Good.
The finest American shooter was in town, and a horse rider, one of the finest, was in town. And he thought, he'd had a few drinks, Reggie, so he thought, well, I'll take him on. Reggie beat him.
Good.
Once at a dinner party, he decided to see if he could ride one of the bulls outside. And he didn't fall off. Although one of the guests did think, actually, Reggie, you were riding a cow. But he said, yes, but I was riding it in a full dinner suit. So really quite an extraordinary character, Reggie Herbert. He spent a lot of time here. There were the Monmouth races, and there was the Abergavenny races.
Oh, gosh.
And he was very well known at Abergavenny. The Abergavenny racecourse no longer exists, nor does the Monmouth one, actually. But the Abergavenny one is now underneath the 18 holes of the Monmouthshire Golf Club.
Oh, right.
It's really hard to compete with Chepstow when they built a larger racecourse there. And Chepstow sort of put Monmouth and Abergavenny almost out of business a bit.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
But you'd often find him there. You would also find a character which I've stumbled across, which we should know about, but we don't. He was clerk of the Monmouth racecourse, and he was also the secretary of every single Monmouth society. Sir Charles Rolls said this man basically is the societies. You would ask him, people would say, oh, we should raise money for this. And Henry Dyke would then take over and basically do all the work. I mean, the things he did for Monmouth and the things he did for racing in South Wales, Henry Dyke, are incredible. he was also 3'6" tall.
Really?
He was known as Little Dyke.
I'm not surprised.
Little
Dirty
Dyke.
little chap. That's
Reggie,
a good English yard of a chap. Isn't
yes.
he? 3'6". Good Lord.
Reggie always said that Little Dyke used to wear a top hat to make him seem taller. But if you're 3'6", I don't think you're going to fool too many people.
Walking around with a 3-foot top hat.
I think Little Dyke basically wore it because he liked to be involved in fashion. You know, I think that was the thing. He would often, you'd see him at the race courses because he was secretary of the race course. He ran Monmouth race course. He was also a racehorse owner. So an extraordinary character. Now things started happening to Little Dyke as well, you see. Yes, there was another riot that Reggie Herbert was involved with. It was at the race course, and this time because there was a jockey back then called Jack Goodwin. Now Jack Goodwin's parents ran the Swan Hotel in Abergavenny. This will mean nothing if no one from Abergavenny watches this video. But if you're from Abergavenny, you know the Swan Hotel. Now, they believed that Jack Goodwin, after a race, hadn't tried. And all those people who'd put money on him, wanted his blood. And so they started to riot at the racecourse. And they tried to break into the enclosure itself. And they pushed down the old railings. And they crowded through. Reggie Herbert tried to fight them off. He was there punching them. Some of the other riders became pugilists and tried to punch them as well. Godwin had survived. The only one apparently blithely not sure what was going on was the Duke of Beaufort, who sat on a bench heartily enjoying himself until the riot got so close it knocked the Duke of Beaufort off his bench. And at this point, it got serious. This is how Reggie Herbert describes what happened. The Duke really seemed to enjoy the situation as he picked himself up, and our forces rallying, we began steadily to drive back the now somewhat discomfited rioters. The uproar still continued, and I could see Little Dyke, who, being badly adapted to a rough and tumble of any sort, had managed to scramble up to the grandstand, waving his arms the while he screamed at the top of his shrill falsetto voice, "Save the Duke, gentlemen! For gold's sake, save the Duke!" And there it is.
Save the Duke. There's Little Dyke with his arms in the air. Oh my goodness. And his unfeasibly large top hat.
Yes. And there's Reggie Herbert. This is horse racing, South Wales 19th century style. Now,
look at the guys facing off in a very pugilistic manner in the background as well. Isn't that wonderful?
There's a bit of fisticuffs.
So one chap looks at there's a bit of a passing resemblance to Colonel Freddie, actually. He's got the same sort of curly moustache and the topper.
I don't know if Colonel Freddie...
Like he crops up in the Spy cartoon that I've seen of Colonel Frederick Morgan.
Yeah, I don't know if Colonel Freddie was there, but he often was, because he would come from Rupera Castle. Lord Tredegar would often come as well. And you'd also have the Duke of Beaufort would use Troy House as his base. Troy House, for those regulars will remember from episode 1. He would use that as a base, and then he would come here. When Troy House was sold, Reggie Herbert remembered all of those wonderful race meetings and fights, apparently. He said, it's such a shame that Troy House has now become a nunnery that takes in washing. It used to be great fun in the old days. Now, because he was magnificent, and the people of South Wales should know more about Henry Dyke, what I do want to say is when Henry Dyke got involved, and we all fear for him, there he is up there. He got involved in a duel. Now, Goff, a duel at that time and before, how much in danger was Little Dyke with a duel?
1890s,
1860s.
1860s. Yeah, quite seriously. It was very frowned upon, but I don't think it had actually necessarily been banned at that stage. Dueling is a peculiar thing. I've been looking a little bit into it. Dueling, it has a very, very long standing, and it actually comes out of military engagements in which stalemates would be decided by either opponent's champions of the day, scrapping it out between them. Basically, a man against man combat to decide the outcome of a battle. So it's got a root within that. I mean, the earliest recorded duel, believe it or not, this battle decided by one-on-one combat, is in the 7th century BCE.
Gosh.
When the champion of the Horatii defeated the champion of the Curatii of Alba Longa. Isn't that a lovely word, set of words there? Yeah, but you're right back in the 7th century BC when this, and so if you look at some of the Homeric stories about the fall of Troy and whatever, I think Achilles crops up doing this sort of thing during battles as well. So it goes right through that, and it runs all the way, right the way through, particularly sort of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. But it is really within a military context. It's not part of about, gentlemen. So a gentleman scrapping with another gentleman for the sake of it, sort of thing. But at one point, I think when that, I suppose the opportunity for knightly combat diminishes in the society, it hangs over in the people who formerly would have been the knights in battle, and they start scrapping on matters of honour, and particularly the 18th century is a period when this sort of goes on and on a ridiculous basis. I mean, there's a lovely quote from Johnson, Dr. Johnson, who says, in a state of highly polished society, an affront is held to be, it must therefore be resented, or rather a duel must be fought upon it, because it was all about honour and how people felt that their honour had to be defended, particularly the honour of a lady had to be defended even more than the honour of the gentleman that was involved in it.
Hence the duel we mentioned at the start.
The duel we mentioned at the start, with Sheridan was defending, what was I forgotten the lady's name now?
Elizabeth Linley.
Elizabeth Linley. But I mean, the number of people who got involved in duels is actually quite astonishing. We go back a little bit earlier, but I mean, the writer Ben Jonson got into an argument with a fellow actor called Gabriel Spencer. It went to a duel. Obviously, they fought with swords. Spencer got killed. Johnson got arrested, found him guilty. They were going to hang him, but he got off with it. Do you know how he got off with it? Yeah. Claimed benefit of clergy. Because at the time...
aristocrats did the same.
He could read a
Lords
page
did the
of
same.
Latin Bible. So he read the page of Latin Bible and he got off with murder and just got branded on the thumb for it at the time. But, I mean, keep moving up later on in the 17th century, you've got the 5th Baron Byron, who was a dangerous lunatic, wasn't he?
Mad Jack,
Mad Jack Byron, absolutely. Not the Byron the poet, but another mad. I mean, he was just a dangerous lunatic, basically. I mean, he was arrested for murder, went before the House of Lords where the trial took place, got off. These things seem to happen. He was found guilty of manslaughter, so having killed somebody, he was just fined for manslaughter for that one. Is it a poet? Sheridan, have you mentioned, got into a scrap? His Royal Highness Frederick, Duke of York, was involved in the duel. This is one of the heirs to the crown. Pitt the Younger, the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington caused a great scandal at the time when he got into a duel because he was actually Prime Minister at the time. And people started to realise that the implications of these things were getting pretty serious. Because people were also starting to duel about absolutely anything. When you get to the 19th century, anything would be considered an affront. There's a case of 2 former military officers riding in...
No, I'm still there. Don't worry. Goff just got a hand up. I'm still listening.
I was startled.
Don't worry.
2 military officers riding in Hyde Park whose dogs got into a scrap. They had an argument about who caused it. Of course, honour had to be satisfied.
Of course.
So they fight a duel at a ridiculously close distance of virtually 6 feet apart. One gets shot, the other one gets killed over the dog. And that sort of thing these went on. I mean, when you get to the, some of the more ridiculous sort of duels, there are some actually quite amusing ones. The petticoat duel, this is what I'm looking for. This was in 1792 when the lady Amelia Braddock took offence at a comment by a Mrs. Elphinstone about her age. Braddock claimed to be 30, whilst Mrs. Elphinstone said that she was actually more like 60. So obviously, this had to be solved by a duel. So they went out and they drew their pistols and they fired at each other. They missed. At which point, under the code, the code of duello, which I'm talking about, they could have actually just sort of let it go. But no, they decided to fight on. So they moved to swords, and eventually Mrs. Elphinstone took a wound, and she then decided that she would write a letter of apology to Lady Almeria Braddock instead. I mean, again, you fight a duel over a comment about age. I mean, about a century later, you look at even the late roundabout similar to this, there was another petticoat duel between the Princess Pauline Metternich and Countess Kiel-Mansregg, who
Names
had an
to conjure with.
Lovely. Who had an argument over floral arrangement at a musical exhibition. So obviously you have to duel about to settle it out. But the wonderful, interesting thing about this one is that they decided they would duel topless. Not just because of any sort of particularly odd reason, but because if you got poked with a sword, then fabric from your clothing could get into the wound and cause a problem. So they decided they would fight topless. They had a Baroness Lubinska who was presiding over the whole affair, sort of managing it, and the gentlemen had to turn their backs before they disrobed, and then they went to it. And of course, as the ladies cried out upon receiving wounds, the gentlemen decided they would rush in and rush to their aid. But Baroness Lubinska kept beating them back with an umbrella while crying, "You lustful wretches!" Because thinking that they were not entirely altruistic in attempting to staunch the blood flow of these topless duellers. It is just absolutely bonkers things that were going on at the time.
So would you? Oh, sorry, Goff.
So yeah, the last fatal duel in the UK was actually fought in 1852.
Right. Okay.
So it had fallen into disrepute by the time Reggie Herbert's having his difficulties. But do you know when the last duel was actually officially fought in this country?
No.
1994.
1994?
1994.
What was that over?
Battle. A lutenist, gentleman who plays the lute, called Ben Solfield, fought a battle against an unnamed gentleman to defend the honour of a lady who had been slighted with cavalry swords with another gentleman. And he felt it was the best way that honour could be satisfied.
Isn't that
But this
splendid?
was all very codified. In 1777, the Clonmel Summer Assizes in Ireland codified the rules of duelling, and it became known as the Code Duello. It has 25 rules. Wow. It goes into absolute minutiae about how things operate, If it depended upon the initial causes of taking of the offence and things like this, So who causes the offence has the first opportunity to apologise. But if after they've been offended, say I said to Paul, Paul, you are a small, irritating little man.
You have said that many times.
Many times. And you said, go away, fatty. Now, I could take offence at being called fatty, but your previous offence at being called a short, irritating little man would actually trump it.
Oh, it takes primacy.
You would be entitled to the apology. And if I decided not to apologise, then we would move to duelling, and our seconds would then go off and arrange things. I mean, it is absolutely minute, the detail they go into about how it's done. One of the principal things of the seconds was, of course, to actually decide where you did it and with what, and to arrange medical cover. They weren't idiots. They actually got a doctor on hand to try and sort these things out as well. But mostly an awful lot of people just turned up, fired at the air, shot wide, Wellington shot wide when they got to it, because the idea of turning up and facing it was done as well. And if at any point, after the first gun had gone off, you could go, that's enough. Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry I called you a short, irritating little man. You don't have to shoot me. So but again, it's absolutely phenomenal. And this code was applied more or less.
Yeah.
But there's a wonderful thing right at the end of it is that if the seconds disagree about any organisation, Rule 25, the last rule, says where the seconds disagree and resolve to exchange shots themselves, it must be as the duellers, but at right angles to them.
I don't know. I quite admire. I think you have to codify something like this. I think it's to do with honour. There's got to be a way of doing it,
At the
right?
same time, it was all notionally illegal.
Well,
to say that if you killed somebody, you know, you didn't. Not everybody got off like Mad Jack Byron, you know, who went before his peers in the House of Lords. It was murder and killing. But again, and I think when there was some sort of serious offence and it had its hangover, it was sort of tolerated. But it was really bodied down, like you said, to absolutely ridiculous, trivial things, ladies fighting over age and men fighting over their dogs in the park. You know, it became ridiculous. So that's why it fell out of favour.
How do you think little Dyke would get on in a duel then, Henry Dyke? Would your money be?
He'd have to have some good seconds because they'd have to play to little Dyke's strengths.
Well, he did have a duel, and Reggie wrote it down. But it's amazing. It's amazing what you just said pops up even in this duel in the 1860s. And this is on one occasion there was nearly a duel at Monmouth races between Empson, who was a racehorse owner, and little Dyke, the manager of the meeting, who insisted that Empson had cast a slur upon his honour. So that's like you said.
Oh yeah.
It will be remembered that I have described Dyke, who was a dwarf, in a previous chapter. The whole affair was most amusing and was eventually left to Lord Jersey to arbitrate, who decided that as no weapons could be found with which the combatants were equally proficient, except their tongues, they should each be allowed to abuse each other for 10 minutes without any pause for refreshments. Got into work, they did this with such good effect that at the expiration of the time limit, they felt that honour was satisfied and shook hands.
No, absolutely spectacular, isn't it?
So he survived that, but I'm sorry to say that little Dyke got into even worse trouble and almost died.
Oh, no.
Because he was a very good friend of a chap called Palmer, who was better known to history as the Prince of Poisoners.
Good Lord.
Palmer's mentioned by Conan Doyle, by so many people. One of the famous poisoners Palmer was. What he would do is he'd get into trouble monetarily, and then he would invite you for dinner, and he would poison you. What he'd actually do to get more money is he would take out life insurance policy on you and then invite you to dinner.
That's a bit barefaced, isn't it? Surely somebody must have spotted that eventually.
Eventually they did, in time, fortunately for Henry Dyke, because he owed Henry Dyke a lot of money. You'd often see them at the race course together. And he invited little Dyke for dinner. Just before Dyke went to the dinner, it was discovered that a chap called Cook had been poisoned. And they traced it through to Palmer, and he was arrested just before he was scheduled to dine with little Dyke.
Good grief.
In fact, he poisoned a man's gin this time in a pub. And some people think that that's where the term, when you go into a pub and you say, "What's your poison?"
What's your poison? Oh,
it comes from Palmer the
Poisoner. The Prince of Poisoners.
The Prince of Poisoners. And he's mentioned in an awful lot of these. I think Dorothy L. Sayers mentions him. He was in Madame Tussauds. He was in Madame Tussauds until the 1970s. So,
in the Chamber of Horrors, I presume, yeah.
Yeah, and also there was a Keith Allen movie about him in 1998. And you know what? They didn't have little Dyke in the film.
Well, I mean, what a glorious opportunity they've wasted. Really, yeah.
A completely missed opportunity.
That's just sizist.
I agree, quite frankly.
Dyke deserves
Great
his
role
moment
as well.
Well, right.
Yeah. So let's move on. Little Dyke's fine, thank goodness. And if we...
I presume he must have dropped off the twig eventually. Do you know what happened to him at the end?
Yeah, he was still working very hard. And he was in 1874. He had heart disease. I mean, his health wasn't great. His height, I think, did contribute. But he kept working on a political campaign, stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning, and he died of a heart attack. And everybody was in mourning. And you know what? All of the obituaries that praised him so much, not a single one mentioned his height. His height was not important to his deeds.
That's very interesting because around about the similar time to this, General Tom Thumb visited Newport with his wife and another little chap called Commodore Nutt. And all the reviews about the audiences, I mean, 2,000 people at a time would turn up at the Victoria Hall in Newport to to see them perform. They commented on their comic timing, their singing voices, their impersonations. General Tom Thumperpad did an absolutely killing impersonation of Napoleon. But, but again, not one of the reviews references in any way that they're small. They talk about their skill and their talent, not their height. And I think it's, obviously, let's not be silly about this. People are going to see them because they're little, but when they get there, they're so impressed by everything else about them, which I think is actually rather nice.
Yeah, certainly Henry Dyke's, what he achieved in his life, against quite a heavy odds in certain aspects of his life. It's amazing, and I'm sorry that I hadn't heard about him before, really.
Yeah, what a great character.
Reggie was very fond of him, as you can imagine. And by this time, Reggie Herbert had got, if he was arrested, he had a way out of it. He had a name he would use, a pseudonym, which you can't see through, Goff. The name he often gave, he pretended to be foreign. The name was Don Rinaldo Herbertino.
My God, it's impenetrable, isn't it?
There was one occasion when he did have to go, and his lawyer's fees. His lawyer's fees were £210. Got him off. But that night, he won £187 back off his lawyer by beating him at whist. So he's quite a thing. But he was in Cliver once, and on the Abergavenny Road that we talked about, they'd put a toll road. They put a toll gate, and they put a lodge to take the tolls. And the people of the area and near the Clitha Arms, they were furious about this. And Reggie didn't want to pay the toll. And so they sort of charged the toll gate, and in the melee, they knocked over the toll keeper. So the next day they went up to him and they gave him a sovereign. He said, "Oh, you can knock me over any time if you keep paying me a sovereign, mister." But that night at Cliver, in the smoking room at Cliver, his house party, including his racing manager and a few others, came up with the idea because Reggie knew quite a bit about local history, and he was a fan of the Rebecca Riots.
Oh, gosh, here we go.
Of the 1840s. And Reggie decided it was time to bring back the spirit of Rebecca. So they had a look round at Cliver, and they found old female caps and old nightshirts. Pajamas were coming in, so the old nightshirts were just on the way out at this point. And so they dressed up. You could look like a woman dressed up like the Rebecca Rioters. And they charged towards this thing under the cover of darkness. Their plan was they had axes to chop down the toll booth and set fire to it. Well, they couldn't do that, so they threw it in the River Usk. And Reggie said, "I waved goodbye to it as it floated towards Newport." They had to stop because you could hear at the Kevin. What am I talking about? At the Clitha Arms, they had to keep people inside so they didn't recognise anyone. So they shouted abuse and they said, "We're armed, stay inside." So everybody did, and that was fine. So the next day, Reggie goes back near the Clitha Arms on that road, and he finds that they've built a bar. So it's a toll bar rather than just a toll booth. And Reggie thinks, "I can handle this one myself." So that night, he turns up with an axe and hacks at the bar, gets rid of it, and he writes "The Spirit of Rebecca" on the and nobody knew who did it. And with great cheek and utter no shame at all, Reggie donated money to the authorities the next day in a bid to catch whoever destroyed the toll booth. But you know what? They never put that did not become a toll road. So the hero at the Battle of the Toll Gates, Mr. Reginald Herbert of Clitha. He lived for quite a long time, actually. And he was a magnificent character. People always kept talking about him. At the age of 87, he was still sprightly.
Oh, gosh.
Still going about it. And he did some act of physical prowess at 87. The newspaper reporter said, "Well, this is extraordinary." And he winked and he said, "Not bad for a baby, my boy, not bad for a..." And his wife, Constance, Constance, was also quite eccentric. If you went to Clytha Park then, you might meet their pet zebra.
Oh yeah.
And on one occasion when Reggie was away and Constance was alone, I don't know where the servants were, but two ruffians managed to force their way into Clytha Park. is that magnificent marble entrance hall we saw. But they were stopped in their track when their enormous pet bear, Bruin, paddled into the hall, trailing his chain behind him.
Trailing what behind him?
Chain.
A chain. Okay, back.
So he had a chain. They just didn't bother.
Yeah, they didn't bother to tie him up. They could let him roam around on the chain. Okay.
So they did say, they said, well, how did you get to sort of this age without, being so well? He said, well, there's exercise is always good and keeping a positive frame of mind. Oh, and most importantly, I'm not a prohibitionist. He started the Anti-Prohibition Society for Abergavenny and Raglan. But he did die at the age of 88 in 1929.
That's pretty good going, isn't it, to get all the way through that period when you consider this is a man way before antibiotics.
And he was, and he was always putting his life in peril, wasn't he?
Well, quite, yeah. He sort of stayed in the background, did he?
No, not at all. He wrote a book, From Roses to Diamonds, which is where I got some of his accounts of Little Dyke and people like that, which is wonderful. He had no male heirs. He had two daughters, and his second daughter, Gladys Herbert, inherited in 1929. And she basically ran the place then. She kept Clytha Castle as well as a folly, but she had a housekeeper in it, and she asked for lodgers. There were 3 families in Clytha Castle. That's how large the folly was at one time.
Right.
But the sitting room remained, so if Miss Herbert wanted to use it, she still could. So you could be there with your family, and then Miss Herbert might come from the big house.
Yeah.
Have a seat in the folly, because it had magnificent views, you see. And she was very well known. In 1950, you could say, I wouldn't say she gave up the ghost, but in 1950, she handed over Clytha Park and the castle to the Welsh office.
Oh.
So she handed it over, and eventually the Welsh office handed it over to the National Trust. So believe it or not, Clytha Park, the mansion and all that area is owned by the National Trust.
I never knew that. Oh, good Lord.
The mansion itself is leased.
Yeah.
And after being damaged in the Second World War and neglected for a little while, in 1972, Sir Richard Hanbury Tennyson became the tenant. A great family, the Hanbury Tennysons.
I'm going to say, that's a fascinating name, isn't it, to conjure with in this area?
Still going, very strong.
The Hanburys, yeah, good Lord.
Tennysons were an Irish family, but the Hanburys, they made their money around Pontypool in the 60s.
That's right, yeah. Hanbury Park and the Folly at the top of the hill. And
the pub in Cullean.
Yeah. Oh, the Hanbury Arms, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Was I thinking? I wasn't even thinking about that one. Never made that connection. It's not ridiculous.
So long since you've been in a pub like the Hanbury Arms. Yeah. So, but Richard Hanbury Tennyson, who was involved with the Gwent County Historical Association, the National Museum of Wales, houses like this were his wheelhouse. He'd served in the war. He was a member of the diplomatic corps. In World War II, he was often ended up lost after D-Day. So, and he would go to, and in a lot of people where he was in Belgium couldn't speak French. It was in the Flemish area. He could speak French. So what he would do is he'd find a local priest and speak Latin to him. That was the only practical use my classical education ever had. But he was very useful because he lovingly restored Clytha Park. So, and that was great. And he lived in it, right up until 2017 when Sir Richard died.
Oh, gosh. That's interesting.
And the Hanbury Tennysons still live in there to this day. Clytha Castle, though, has a different use. Yeah. It's run by the Landmark Trust as a holiday cottage.
Oh, blimey.
I mean, we talked, didn't we, Goff, about the possible uses of these properties. Yeah. This is very different, isn't it?
It is, isn't it? This is very different. Yeah, very different altogether. Yeah. Oh, that's splendid.
Doesn't that look lovely?
It does, doesn't it? That's magnificent.
Yeah. That looks great. So, yes, you can rent out Clytha Castle. This magnificent folly. Looks nice, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well.
Little kitchen.
Very acceptable. A round kitchen, that's very good.
Some of these paintings, I'd like to see who they are. There is a painting, I think, of William Jones in one of the rooms. I'm
Oh,
also
really?
interested in what's in Clytha Park, actually, what paintings are there, what were left there that may have... Reggie Herbert had so many paintings of dogs on the wall.
Yeah.
When he retired as the master of the Monmouthshire foxhounds, they actually gave him, believe it or not, a life-size silver fox.
Oh, good Lord. Oh, that's very nice.
Very nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Cliver.
Well. Yeah. Still rumbling along, still lived in. That's one of our first properties to get to, that actually still lived in.
Yeah, now...
What a fantastic group of characters. Isn't it funny how that, we've never really heard of them? Isn't that strange?
No, I hadn't at
We don't
all.
know enough about some of these wonderful people that lived in this area. We tend to get a bit, particularly Newtonians, get very swamped by the Industrial Revolution and on all that type of heritage. We don't really pick up on some of the more rural agricultural estates type thing that was still around and flourishing at the time.
No, I particularly liked, Reggie Herbert is great, but Little Dyke just came completely out of the blue.
What a wonderful chap.
Such a colourful character, and that little sketch of him, Save the Duke, on
the balcony.
is just wonderful.
Yeah.
So Cliver, now we might do Llanarth at some point with the cousins. We've got so many properties. And one of our friends, did you catch this comment, Goff? One of our friends put on Facebook, picked up on a comment you made in the last episode, the last video, when you rightly said that history was people. And she said, well, I understand, you're absolutely right, Goff, she said. But the problem is, if there's no access, such as with Kevin Mabley, and maybe even to the property we've talked about tonight, Clytha Park, where do you tell the stories?
Oh, that is, yeah, how do you get the stories out? That's the interesting thing.
Which is possibly why we haven't heard of Reggie Herbert or Little Dyke. But hey, this is where we tell stories.
Well, this is where you get the stories now. It's us. This is we're doing our duty. Yeah, no, but that is quite true. But I think the principle of trying, you need to focus and bring the people out, I think. And I think, again, if you're not looking at them and if you're not finding it, they're not going to spontaneously sort of crop up. You can look at, the wonderful places like Tintern Abbey, but you can come out there with never knowing the name of a single monk that was ever there. And I think that's quite sad sometimes, to forget the people and just look at the property. But you're right, maybe there needs to be more, just little something to try to, collect these wonderful little nooks and crannies and anecdotes and do something with them.
Mm. Well, we'll try. We'll try to, in our own very little way, to our very little audience. We'll keep on with the stories because they amuse us more than anything else. It's great fun.
I'm endlessly titillated
by it. But one thing there are many things we're not that great at. You're probably already figuring this out for yourself. But when it comes to PR, when it comes to actually pushing ourselves, we are the worst. Don't be fooled, however. We may look like idiots at this sort of thing and sound like idiots. Don't be fooled. We are idiots at this sort of thing. So if you could help us, if you like the video down below, that helps the algorithm. It means there's a greater chance of it being suggested by YouTube to other people. And if you click subscribe, that means you won't miss a video as well. But even better, if you share the video on any local community group on Facebook or to your friends who might be interested, that would really help spread the tale of Little Dyke and all of these characters. Yes. So we would, because we're rubbish at that sort of thing. Yeah. So thank you, Goff. That was good fun.
It has been a pleasure as always, Mr. B.
I love the fact that we did an episode about Little Dyke and you barely mentioned my height, and for that I shall love you forever. Thank you for watching, and we will be back very soon.